You're listening to Willamette Wake Up. I'm Melanie Zermer. Christian nationalism is a political movement, while relatively small in numbers, is a loud voice in today's United States of America. Christian nationalism's beliefs intersect with white identity, anti-Black, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, and anti-immigration sentiments. Christian nationalism also supports patriarchy, authoritarianism, and support for violence. Seth Cotlar is a professor of history at Willamette University who studies the history of the modern American right. And I've asked him here today to talk about its history and a recent study by the Public Religion Research Institute, or PRRI, on Christian nationalism specifically, and what that might mean for people living here in the Mid-Willamette Valley. So welcome, Seth. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let's start with how you got interested in studying the modern American right.
That's a long story. I'll try to make it short. So I started as a historian of early America. That's how I was trained. So my first book was about Thomas Paine and the Americans who loved him in the 1790s. And then I also had a side interest in contemporary misappropriations of the founding era. I got really interested in fake quotes from the founders that were very popular on right-wing social media in the 2000s. Glenn Beck, Heritage Foundation, all these places would post a quote of something that they believed, and then they would attribute it to George Washington or Thomas Paine, and almost invariably they would be completely made up. And so I thought this was kind of funny and sort of interesting, especially because these were the people who claimed to be the originalists, who claimed to really honor the founding, and yet they seem to have no compunction about just making stuff up and attributing it to these people. So I started teaching a course on the history of American conservatism in 2010, the Tea Party era, and mostly because I thought it was important for students to understand the American right, not to just kind of make fun of it or to see it as a deficit of knowledge or ideas, but rather to see it as a part of the kind of American political tradition, regardless of whether one agreed with it or disagreed with it. And one of the themes in that historiographical literature about conservatism is organized around the question of how do we understand the relationship between what we might think of as the reasonable conservatives, like William F. Buckley is the example that many people give, and the folks who were to his right, the kind of more conspiratorially minded groups like the John Birch Society and other groups like that. And so that question really interested me, how to distinguish between those two varieties of conservatism in the U.S. And one of the things that emerged in the literature is that we've tended to see that distinction between the reasonable conservatives and the folks who are more far right as far more of a bright line than it actually was in practice. And so just to give one example, a significant number of the subscribers to William F. Buckley's National Review were members of the John Birch Society. So even though he criticized the John Birch Society, the fact was the people reading his magazine were often members and really supportive of it. This then became more relevant after 2016, obviously, when people started trying to figure out, there were all those never Trumpers who were saying, like, how did this happen to my party? So this is where historians like myself kind of entered into the conversation to try to help people understand the long history of a kind of populist, often anti-Semitic, kind of white nationalist, anti-pluralist, Islamophobic kind of right that harbored all of the ideals that supposedly the principled conservatives like William F. Buckley had banished as beyond the pale, but which seemed to suddenly explode onto the surface in the person of Donald Trump. So for me, this just opened up this question of like the long history of the far right that we really just didn't know that much about. We'd always regarded such figures as kind of kooks, as fringe. Everyone loved to make fun of the John Birch Society, but that was about it. People didn't really understand it. They just like to poke fun at it. And so I got interested in trying to understand those kind of groups, not as just an object of ridicule, but as actual players in American politics.
Okay. Your interest was studying the American right in a general way, but Christian nationalism seems to be a pretty loud voice within that grouping right now. And I don't even know where to put things like the Patriot Front or the Proud Boys, but it seems like there's a lot of different factions. So maybe let's focus on Christian nationalism then, and maybe we can go into that study that I'd mentioned earlier, the Public Religious Research Institute, or PRRI study. Maybe for our listeners, Seth, you could just give us overall of its findings.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to do that. So, and this organization is a really interesting organization. It's run and staffed primarily by folks who are themselves evangelical Protestants. The founder of it grew up in the Southern Baptist Church, and many of them are folks who were kind of turned off by what they perceive to be the kind of rising Christian nationalism inside the evangelical church, and are hoping to draw public awareness to it, not from a place of being opposed to the church or to evangelical Protestantism or anything like that, but out of a desire to call out what they perceive to be unchristian elements that are emerging in certain parts of that world, especially the white evangelical church.
The group doing the study is evangelical Christians.
Right. It's coming from critics inside the church, right, who are concerned about the direction that the white evangelical church in the U.S. Has been heading for the last couple decades. The definition of Christian nationalism that I find really useful comes from a scholar of religion who's named Jamar Tisby, who is affiliated with this institution. He describes it as, quote, an ethno-cultural ideology that uses Christian symbolism to create a permission structure for the acquisition of political power and social control. So I'll repeat that because that's a lot. An ethno-cultural ideology that uses Christian symbolism to create a permission structure for the acquisition of political power and social control. And so I think the key element there is, or there's several key elements. One, this idea that it's an ethno-cultural ideology, that it has an implied positive valuation of whiteness over other ethnic and sort of racial categories. It's an ideology in the sense that it's a bundle of ideas that people are articulating, and it uses Christian symbolism. So part of the argument that critics of Christian nationalism would make is that it claims to be an authentic part of the Christian tradition, and what they would claim is that it's just using Christian symbolism to further a kind of ideological end that is profoundly, as they would see it, unchristian in the sense that it elevates white people over others, and that it sort of delegitimizes the religious freedom and rights of folks who do not worship the way those folks do. And this idea that it creates a permission structure, I think, is interesting, in that it enables people to be their most exclusionary, angry, victimized, and hateful selves, which is not necessarily who people are always. That, people are a product of the circumstances in which they find themselves and the communities in which they find themselves. And that when leaders of your community are telling you that, like, look, white Christian people are under threat, and if we don't fight back and defend ourselves against this threat coming from whether it be immigrants or people of color or Jews or whoever the enemy, Marxists, et cetera, might be, that the claim is that you are called to feel venomous hatred towards these people who supposedly hate you and want to destroy you and your church, and you are called to perhaps even engage in violence to defend it from them. And these critics of Christian nationalism would say that is not a particularly Christian way of sort of being in the world, right? And thinking about one's fellow citizens. So this is why they would say it uses Christian symbolism rather than articulates what they would see as a more authentic understanding of Christ's teachings. And so, and the other piece of this Christian nationalist project is now that's become so intertwined with Donald Trump. Until the moral majority of the late 70s and early 80s, the relationship between sort of white evangelicals and politics was much more distant and divorced. And so the moral majority in the 80s was the moment when white evangelical Christians started to feel like they had to get into the political fray, right, and become more politically active. And this is just the kind of continuation and the amplification of that trend. And again, the idea that what Jesus would want is for you to vote Republican. For many people who are Christian, it's like, well, no, right? That the teachings of the Bible are so much more capacious and complicated than just you have to vote red instead of blue, right? That's a kind of profaning of God's sort of power and omnipotence. And so this wedding, close connection between, I go to this church and therefore I vote for this political party is something that, up until the 1980s or 90s, most American Christians would have regarded as not part of that's not why you go to church, right? You don't go to church to do politics. If anything, church is the place where you're supposed to kind of leave that at the door and think about other things.
That's changed now.
Right. I mean, at this point, I think it was white evangelicals, something like 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And I believe it's around the same number in 2020. Just about any other demographic, Donald Trump lost.
If you've just joined us, I'm talking with Seth Cotlar. He's a professor of history at Willamette University who's been studying the history of the modern American right political movement. We're talking also specifically about Christian nationalism and how it's come to be and what some of the tenets are of that belief system. And we started talking about a research study by Public Religion Research Institute. And I would like for you to just share with our listeners what was found in that study. What were some of the belief systems that define a Christian nationalist?
So they asked a series of questions and asked people if they agreed with them. And then they created what they called a Christian nationalist scale. And so they created these categories of Christian nationalist adherents who agreed with all or almost all of the tenets, and then a category of Christian nationalist sympathizers, who are people who are generally receptive to it and open to it. And what they found was that about 10% of Americans are Christian nationalist adherents, so about 1 out of 10, and then an additional 19% identified as Christian nationalist sympathizers. So this means 30% of the U.S. is either kind of an adherent or a sympathizer of this ideology that they identify as Christian nationalism. And let me just read. So these were the questions that they had, five statements that they said to people and asked them if they agreed with them. And if they said yes, then that put them in the kind of Christian nationalist category. So here's what they are. So the first one is that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. 20% of participants in the study agreed with that. Then they asked, the U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. 27% of the respondents agreed with that statement. The next statement was that being Christian is an important part of being truly American. 30% said yes to that, agreed with that. The next question, and as you can tell, these become less extreme as you go. So the fourth one was, if the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. And 38% said yes to that. And then the final statement was that U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. And 40% said yes to that.
That's a pretty hefty number.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see how, the difference between, so that first statement that I made, which was
Sure.
God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. That's a far more extreme statement. 20% said yes to that, whereas twice as many people said yes to the statement that U.S. laws should be based on Christian values.
And whatever that means. Love thy neighbor as thyself.
Precisely, right. So there's a kind of fuzziness there. And so I would assume that everybody who said yes to the idea that Christians should exercise dominion over all aspects of American society, that those people also said yes to U.S. law should be based on Christian values. But then there's an additional 20% of people who said, yes, it should be based on Christian values, but we're like, oh, no, Christians shouldn't exercise dominion over all areas of American society, right? They didn't agree with that. So this is why, like, when we think about this, I mean, Christian nationalism, it's not like there's a membership list or there's a card you get or there's a T-shirt you wear or there's an organization that you belong to. It's simultaneously, I think, a very real ideological configuration in our culture today, in our society. But it's also important that we be mindful of the range of people who fit under that general umbrella. And I think this is why, for the folks who did this study, they want to draw attention to the fact that it's not like these are opinions that people have had their whole lives. It's not like these are opinions that people, if presented with alternative ways of thinking about things, wouldn't be open to changing their minds or kind of rethinking it, right? And so this is why in doing the study, they were just trying to kind of draw attention to the prevalence of some of these ideas and the potentially anti-democratic implications of some of them, in the sense that it potentially encourages people to think of America not as a religiously pluralistic society. And again, religious pluralism, from at least my life, has always been a kind of foundational idea in the United States as to what kind of country we are. And obviously, if you think that Christians should dominate American society and everybody else is less truly American than a Christian is, that runs askance with this idea of America as a religiously pluralistic society. And then the other piece of this is what they found is that these Christian nationalist beliefs tended to correspond with attitudes that we could identify as racially intolerant and exclusionary. And so,
which really confused me when I realized that within that grouping of 20 to 30%, there were people of color that identified as Christian nationalists, even though part of the belief system would not encompass them, would not embrace them. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, so again, this is where it's an immensely complicated dynamic, in the sense that, so for example, Black evangelicals are a really substantial portion of the Black population in the U.S. And even though Black churches and white churches are frequently quite segregated in the U.S., there's still institutional overlap in terms of their ideas about not necessarily politics, in the sense that Black evangelicals overwhelmingly vote Democratic and white evangelicals overwhelmingly vote Republican, but in the sense that they see Christian morality and values as being essential to what it means to be a good person. And saying that has a different kind of meaning to it when it's coming out of the mouth of a white person than when it's coming out of the mouth of a Black American, in that the long history of white conservatives understanding Black poverty as the result of a moral failing on the part of Black people, rather than understanding it as a result of hundreds of years of slavery and Jim Crow and systemic inequality, right? So often when a white evangelical church is talking about the need for poor people to go to church and become more moral and to live a more Christian life in order to make their lives better, that carries with it this whole baggage of kind of racist ideas about inequality in the U.S. Whereas in a Black church, it comes out of a much different kind of tradition of self-help and a tradition of kind of mutual aid and community aid. So they can be speaking the same language and reading the same scriptures, sharing the same faith in a bunch of ways, but it just has it signifies differently. So it's a very long study, and they asked just a bunch of questions. But one thing that they found is that, for example, when you ask people a question, for example, should we prevent people from majority Muslim countries from entering the U.S.? Like, do you agree with that? And if you ask all Americans, about 30% say yes. If you ask Christian nationalist adherents, 2/3 say yes. So on all of these questions, the likelihood that one gives the answer that is more exclusionary and more racist is about twice as common amongst Christian nationalist adherents and sympathizers than it is amongst just general Americans. So it's not that like every single person who is a Christian nationalist also harbors racist ideas about Black people or is Islamophobic.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that on aggregate, one is far more likely to have an opposition to religious pluralism, to have an opposition to the idea of multiracial democracy. Mm-hmm. And so I think for them, they're thinking about Christian nationalism as a culture, as a political culture that's getting kind of reproduced and disseminated, especially through white evangelical churches as institutions. And again, really important to emphasize, not all white evangelical churches by any means, right? Mm-hmm. That there's significant numbers of white evangelical churches that reject Christian nationalism explicitly and are very critical of it. And there's nothing kind of necessary about embracing these religiously anti-pluralistic ideas or embracing these kind of racist ideas about America and being a white Christian. But part of what's happened with the dynamic that we see, like, for example, in the Reawaken America tour,
which came here to Salem last summer.
And in which, I watched a good chunk of it. The racially exclusionary stuff was not particularly prevalent in what I saw, but the Islamophobia was, and especially the homophobic and transphobic rhetoric was very amplified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I noticed that in the study, they don't really ask any questions about queer or transgender or LGBTQ people. Right. However, what you're saying is in this reawakening tour and what we're seeing in many legislatures in the country, that seems to be a focus.
Right. And the thing that I would say about that is that there's an easy conservative position to take vis-a-vis trans and queer people, which is that like, well, I myself am not trans or queer, but what do I care? How someone identifies in terms of their gender or who they sleep with, like that's no business of mine. And so therefore, like, whatever, like maybe I personally don't like it, but if other people want to do it, it's no skin off my nose. Right.
Right.
So that would be, in the kind of Bill Buckley model of this older kind of form of conservatism, that would just be a matter of like, well, okay, well, why are we spending all this time legislating mm-hmm. and creating this panic around this?
Around such a small group of people.
Right. We're referring to a small group of people, and it's a small group of people who, if you believe in personal freedom, like what they're doing is they're expressing their personal freedom in ways that maybe you don't agree with, but that's really not your place to like tell other people how to live freely. So that's why what's distinct about the way the Reawakening tour, for example, or the sort of far right today, the Christian nationalists talk about LGBTQ folks, is that they frame them as an existential threat, as part of this conspiracy, international conspiracy, or cultural Marxist conspiracy, or whatever they call it, right? That apparently is being funded by George Soros. And that they're using the media and they're using the school system to brainwash children and turn them into, queer or trans kids.
Yeah, they use the term grooming.
Right, precisely. So it becomes a conspiracy theory in which Christian patriotic American white people are the victims of this supposed conspiracy that is out to get them and to harm their children, which is not accurate, but which gives legitimacy then to the calls for the political mobilization, but also, as we've seen with the Proud Boys and Patriot Front and other groups who are physically intimidating drag shows and other events, it seems as if the implication is that one is called to perhaps do violence, right, against people who are supposed agents of this nefarious ideology. And so that's the place where the connection between the folks on the furthest right edge of the spectrum who are very comfortable with the idea of using violence against their perceived enemies, and folks who perhaps express a just a concern about it and a worry about it, but who use those concerns and worries and amplify those concerns and worries in order to get elected or in order to, drive clicks on social media or sell books or sell tickets to a Reawaken America tour or whatever it is that they're doing to kind of scapegoat and target this subset of Americans. It's a very old playbook, or to use Jamar Tisby's language, it's giving people permission to act out their worst selves to people who they don't even know.
And again, we're talking with Seth Cotlar. He's a professor of history at Willamette University, talking about Christian nationalism. And with respect to that survey that we were talking about, a couple of takeaways that I had, and I just wondered your take on it. There's this belief in male dominance. Today's world, they're persecuted for just acting out their human nature. And that reminded me of a historian I heard speak. She was a Christian herself, speaking at a Christian college. And she was talking about this belief leading to the idea that rape is always a woman's fault because boys will be boys.
Yeah, I mean, and it connects to the kind of broader sort of patriarchal culture in which men are understood to have sexual access to women's bodies. Many folks have pointed out the obsession with groomers amongst white evangelicals is ironic, given the number of scandals that have come out in terms of youth pastors or other church pastors who have abused their positions of power. And this is in part why a significant number of young women left the church, right, because of their experience of being subjected to this kind of patriarchal sexual abuse. Again, there's not a necessary relationship between having a set of beliefs about gender and then acting out in a criminal way towards other people, but it makes it far more likely to happen, right? And it also creates a culture in which women speaking out about abuse that they've experienced tend to be believed far less. And it's more dangerous for them to kind of speak out. Again, I also want to emphasize there's a huge community of feminists and critics of toxic patriarchy within the white evangelical church who've drawn attention to the way that this actually detracts from coming to a full understanding of the teachings of the Bible. But the folks on the Christian nationalist side of the spectrum, just like they tend to have more negative opinions about Muslims, tend to have more negative opinions about people of color. They also tend to have, I think, what they would identify as more traditional, but a historian will tell you they're not particularly necessarily traditional, but traditional ideas about gender, in which women are understood to be naturally more subservient and men are understood to be more dominant.
So then another takeaway I had is that there's the belief that being charitable does not equate to working toward a just society. So that leads me to believe, don't expect people who hold Christian nationalist beliefs to rally behind having good prenatal care or access to quality child care or helping single moms get out of poverty, even though they may be left with fewer options to control their own bodies so that more unintended births come to pass.
Right. Yeah. And this taps in, I mean, the Christian nationalist tradition that goes back to the 1920s and 30s has always been profoundly anti-statist. It's simultaneous's authoritarian and anti-statist, which might sound like a contradiction, but I'll try to explain why it's not. In that it's always has a deep opposition to the federal government. And this is part of the context of the New Deal from the 1930s and the 1940s. And this is in part why kind of more mainstream Republicans were able to make common cause with Christian nationalists, and that what they shared was a deep suspicion of an animosity towards the federal government. And there's this sense that the federal government will always be a source of tyranny and injustice, though it will say it's doing this in the name of equality. So this also goes back to the civil rights movement and the school desegregation of the 1950s and 1960s. So a lot of Christian nationalists regarded federal mandates to integrate schools as a form of tyrannical power. This is where the connection between white supremacy and Christian nationalism and the anti-government sentiment emerges. And so a lot of folks would say, there are all these Christian academies, private schools that were founded in the South in the 1960s. Just coincidentally, all of a sudden, people got really interested in founding private schools right when the public schools were being integrated. It was not a coincidence at all. One can go to a private school, a private religious school, not for white supremacist reasons, right? However, if one is going to a largely white private Christian school in the 2020s, one needs to be, I would say, mindful of the history behind where this came from. So that opposition to the federal government as a source of equality and justice is a central pillar of a kind of, white supremacist understanding of the United States, a kind of neo-Confederate kind of vision of the United States. And so this maps onto a whole bunch of different issues. In the West, it can take on the coloration like around the Bundys with federal lands, right? So the idea that, Cliven Bundy was being incredibly oppressed by having to pay $1 per head of cattle to graze his cattle on the 1 million acres of federal land that he was grazing his cattle on, right? But as he saw it, this was completely unjust, right? The federal government has no right, to claim this land and to charge me this nominal fee. What brought us here was this vision of justice, right? That their vision of justice is a very local, personal, face-to-face notion of justice, right? So that when you are a Christian in your church, the way you enact mercy and justice and kindness towards others is you set up a soup kitchen and you feed people who are hungry.
You don't go to the legislature and advocate for minimum wage. That's a living wage. Right. Because the perception is that any kind of solution that's going to come on a larger scale and through a secular government always runs the risk of going down that slippery slope towards totalitarianism. And it's important to note that many of the organizations that do a ton of important work to help support and feed homeless people in Salem are churches, right? Sure.
So it's not as if they don't actually walk the walk. My criticism would be that it's often then accompanied by organized opposition to efforts to find more systemic, larger scale solutions that help us figure out how did people get into a situation where they're homeless and how might we prevent this from happening more in the future. That I think they would say it's not coming out of an animosity towards the poor. It's coming out of a sense of the poor will always be with us. These problems cannot be solved on Earth. Attempts to solve them will just produce even worse problems, they would say. And so therefore, the best that we can do, right, is to just give charity at a local interpersonal level.
All right. Well, thank you for giving us that perspective. Again, I'm talking with Seth Cotlar. He's a professor of history at Willamette University, talking about Christian nationalism. And I did want to bring it back home to the Mid-Willamette Valley. We talked about it somewhat. We talked about the Reawakening Tour. There was a lot of opposition to that. People showed up at the Kaiser City Council meeting and asked the city council to not let them meet at Volcano Stadium. City council said, well, we rent that property to the volcanoes. They can use it however they want. But just to point out that there was a lot of opposition to that. And then at the end of January, there was a Right to Life march, and the Rose City Nationalists showed up, which is a local Christian national group. I understand you are at that march. Any observations from having been there?
Not really. I sort of stopped by quickly and was surprised to see an organization that is an explicitly neo-Nazi fascist organization there. And I will say that I didn't see any interactions between them and the other folks who were in the crowd. I mean, to me, when we think of the U.S. right, it's important that we understand it as a continuum of folks who don't all agree on everything. But one of the dynamics that often happens on the right is that there are efforts on the part of folks who are further to the right to recruit people, to kind of drag folks who are just maybe, kind of center-right Republican, and to encourage them to become more comfortable with the idea of maybe joining a militia and maybe starting to train, and then maybe thinking that maybe they need to engage in violence, right, in order to advance their political goals. And so this is always been a dynamic on the right, where the people on the farther edges of the right. And the way that they do that is by couching their appeals in terms that kind of water down what they really think and what they really believe. Because what they really think and really believe, most Americans would regard as quite extreme and unappealing. And so they know that. And so therefore they have to kind of couch it in terms where they can find common ground with people. So to give one example, the Rose City Nationalists brought with them a flag that is an American Revolutionary era flag called the Appeal to Heaven flag. And that flag, just in the last 15 years or so, has become an emblem of Christian nationalists, and not neo-Nazi fascists like the Rose City Nationalists, but more just kind of mainstream Christian nationalists, if you will. So what these neo-Nazis were doing, and it's just a significant number of neo-Nazis are not Christian, right? And most Christians, I think, would not regard Nazis as in their religious tradition, but they're being opportunistic, right? And they know that if they stand there and even though they're in these intimidating masks that they were wearing and black, wearing all black and khakis and with patches that, if you know the references, are Nazi symbols, they're waving this flag that's the Appeal to Heaven flag that has resonances of, George Washington. And it was flown during January 6th when people were, storming the Capitol on January 6th. And it's flown in a significant number of Christian nationalist churches where, people go dressed nicely on Sunday and worship God. And there's the Appeal to Heaven flag up on the stage behind the pastor. And so what these groups who are on the further right edge of this continuum are trying to do is to make themselves seem more amenable, less threatening to, what to me seemed largely like a gathering of kind of Christian families, of people who go to churches who oppose abortion, who don't consistently read, Adolf Hitler's letters or, are not obsessed with the international Jewish conspiracy, but who these fascists hope might be radicalized. So in that sense, it's, it bothers me when people treat all 1,000 people who show up at an event as being the same, sharing the same worldview, because I just don't think that's fair or accurate. But on the other hand, I think it's important not to be naive about where a lot of the energy on the American right is today, and where a lot of that energy is around people who don't believe in multiracial democracy and people who don't believe in religious pluralism. And it's not just that they don't believe in it, it's that they're actively working to make those things not a legal and political reality in the US. And we're still very far off from that. But in 2017, one of the first things that Donald Trump did when he became president was he tried to do the Muslim ban, right? And there was a massive wave of protest against it. And so he sort of gave up on it. But that was sending a signal to a good number of the sort of Christian nationalists in his coalition, for whom Islam is not just one of the world's great historic religions. Islam is fundamentally un-American and a threat to the United States. I and the majority of Americans think that is just wrong. That is just a wrong thing to say and a wrong thing to believe. And I would even go so far as to say it's un-American. But to them, and this is where they will couch it, 9/11 provided a useful way for folks to then say, oh, well, no, this is just about terrorism. We're not opposed to Islam in general. We're just opposed to terrorists, which for some people was a truly held belief, but for many others was just a cover for their Islamophobia, which became apparent in terms of how they responded to white militia terrorism, which is that they didn't care about it at all.
So it sounds like, by way of wrapping up, Christian nationalism is out there. The beliefs are held by a small portion of our population, yet at the same time could be dangerous if it grows and they start to use some of their beliefs, like using violence to gain further political gains.
Right. Yeah. So to return to that study, one of the findings So in terms of how people responded to the question or to the statement, the United States is a white Christian nation, and I am willing to fight to keep it that way. When presented with that statement, 17% of respondents agreed with it. And so this is where, thinking about it as a permission structure, should you have a political party or a political leader who says, hey, we are losing our country and you need to fight to keep it that way. And of that 17%, my guess is 99.9% of them voted for Donald Trump or, would support the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good chunk of the Republican Party who agrees with this idea that America is a white Christian nation and they might need to fight to keep it that way.
So what would you say to those of us who do not hold those beliefs, who are concerned about people using violence to get what they want politically? What would you say to the rest of us coming from a historical point of view, Seth Cotlar?
One thing that we've learned from the history of radicalism and the government in the past is that extreme clampdowns on the radical right, like Waco is on people's minds these days, and Ruby Ridge, is that frequently what these end up doing is that they just generate more public sympathy for folks on the far right, right? So if there was some easy solution, like, oh, well, let's just have the FBI infiltrate them and then, shut them down. But A, I don't think that works. And B, I don't think that's particularly constitutional, right? As someone who believes in freedom of speech and freedom of association, which are essential American principles, right? So, this is a less dramatic and less clear-cut kind of way to deal with it. But to me, a lot of it has to do with just talking to people, family members, friends, coworkers, and just kind of educate people on what seems to be a pablum. Oh, they're just a Christian and a patriot who loves America and thinks it's under assault. And just saying like, okay, well, there's a long history to people saying these things. And the people who were saying those things frequently were like profoundly anti-Semitic, profoundly racist, and religiously bigoted towards other religious groups. And that those things, religious bigotry, racism, et cetera, are not American values that we should share and should try to amplify. I feel like this is why a lot of times these movements and these groups have to use coded language, because they know that they're pushing against what the majority of American citizens believe or want to believe. But a small and emboldened, empowered minority can do a lot of, in my mind, damage. They can really wield a lot of political power. And so it's up to folks who don't agree with them to be vocal about it and to show up and be counter-protesting or just doing other things to make clear that their commitment to religious pluralism and multiracial democracy is not just an abstract thing that they're going to type on their computer, but is something, they're willing to organize around politically and to show up in support of.
Great. Thank you so much. Now, I understand you've got some sort of a blog coming up. Can you share that with us at this time?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm on Substack. It's just, if you just Google my name, Seth Cotlar, and Substack, it should show up. Over the coming year and a half, I'm going to be working on a book about a Christian nationalist in Oregon. His name was Walter Huss, who was a far-right activist in Oregon from the early 1960s up into the late 1990s. He led a campaign in 1990 to take MLK's name off of MLK Boulevard in Portland. He did not succeed, but it was an incredibly influential moment. He also was the chair of the Oregon Republican Party in 1978. He got elected chair of the Oregon Republican Party. And he was far-right Christian nationalist who believed America belonged to white people and believed it belonged to Christian people. He was a virulent anti-Semite. He was a Holocaust denier. And he had ties to a wide range of neo-Nazis and far-right domestic terrorists. And so how someone like him becomes the chair of the Oregon Republican Party and continues to wield a significant amount of political influence on the right in Oregon for 40 years between the early 1960s into the late 1990s is a story that I think I mean, people outside of Oregon, no one's ever heard of him. And most people in Oregon have also really never heard of him. And so there are 57 boxes of his papers at the University of Oregon. I'm the first person to look at them. I'm 49 out of 57 boxes through them. And what I'm going to do in that Substack blog is just kind of share what I found and what I've learned about him and what it tells me about Oregon more broadly and the history of the right. And the idea is that eventually this will be a book of some sort. The first draft of history, I guess we could say.
Oh, great. Well, I think that's exciting. And thank you for doing that. I think history, if we listen to history, if we really understand its implications, it could very well lead to better decisions. Now, I can't say that's been the case, but it certainly is a tool for that. And I thank you for joining us today. Again, Seth Cotlar with the History Department at Willamette University. Thanks so much for joining us and giving so much of your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.